Lake Superior is the largest freshwater lake in the world by surface area, and the largest of the Great Lakes by both surface area and volume. It spans more than 30,000 square miles, and holds more water than the other four Great Lakes combined, enough to cover North and South America with 12 inches of water. Lake Superior is also vital in America's steel production, since the lake is surrounded by iron ore ranges in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. But Lake Superior is also the coldest of the Great Lakes. Water temperatures in the lake average only 40 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the year. It's estimated that there are more than 5,000 shipwrecks at the bottom of Lake Superior, with around half of them undiscovered as of the release of this video. Here are 5 nearly forgotten shipwrecks on Lake Superior. In 1907, the American Shipbuilding Company in Lorain, Ohio began construction on a freighter labeled Hull number 353 that would be named the SS Cypress. The Cypress was one of 8 nearly identical freighters being constructed for the Lackawanna Steamship Company based out of Cleveland. The freighter was launched on August 17, 1907. When launched, she was one of the largest freighters on the lakes. She measured 420 feet or 130 meters in length. She had a beam of 52 feet or 16 meters and had a cargo capacity of 7,500 tons. She was powered by a 1,500 horsepower triple expansion steam engine that drove a single screw. And during her brief career, the Cypress was under the command of 48-year-old Captain Frank Hike, who had nearly 30 years of experience sailing, and to him, it seemed that the Cypress would enjoy a long and successful career. On the morning of October 10, 1907, the Cypress departed Superior, Wisconsin on her second voyage with a load of just over 7,000 tons of iron ore, bound for Buffalo, New York. The Cypress enjoyed calm weather for the first 24 hours of the voyage, but then, on the morning of October 11th, a mild storm blew over Lake Superior. For the Cypress, there was no cause for concern. Almost every ship on the lakes could handle much worse conditions. However, another vessel, the freighter Charles O. Jenkins, was also fighting her way through the storm not far from the Cypress, when the captain of the Jenkins noticed that the Cypress was rolling heavily in the mild seas. He thought that the crew of the Cypress would raise a distress flag, but no distress signals were issued from the Cypress, and the captain of the Jenkins turned his attention back to fighting his way through the storm. Soon, the storm intensified as the Cypress made her way across Lake Superior, but still, it was nothing that the brand new freighter couldn't handle. Around noon, another vessel, the freighter George Stephenson, encountered the Cypress, and the captain of the Stephenson noticed that the Cypress was trailing a red wake. However, both ships were handling the storm with no problems whatsoever. But then, a few hours after the Cypress encountered the Stephenson, the Cypress's second mate realized that the ship was now in the midst of a full gale. He was sent to inspect the freighter's hold, where he found there was a small amount of water that entered the ship, and some of her cargo of iron ore had shifted, which caused the Cypress to develop a slight list at port. By early evening, the storm had worsened, and waves easily crashed over the deck of the freighter, which allowed water to pour deep into her holds. The crew knew that their ship couldn't handle much more. The ship's lists to port only increased, and Captain Hike ordered his crew to head to the stern to prepare the lifeboats and don their life jackets, but he didn't issue an abandoned ship. Unfortunately, while Captain Hike did his best to keep the ship afloat, the ship had developed a 20-degree list, and her spar deck submerged beneath the surface. And soon, the Cypress lost steam pressure, and she was rapidly sinking. Just before 8 p.m., the men in the pilot house went to prepare the raft in the ship's forward section, and soon, the Cypress capsized on her port side, throwing everyone on deck into the monstrous waves. 4 men managed to climb aboard the raft, including second mate Charles Pitts. For the next several hours, the men paddled the raft 18 miles to the shore, and they were thrown into the water several times when the raft was flipped over by the massive waves, but made it back onto the raft. At 2 a.m., the shore was in sight, but then the raft was flipped over once again. Second mate Charles Pitts made it back onto the raft, but he realized he was alone, only a few hundred feet from the beach. He swam all the way to the beach just half a mile from the Deer Park Life-Saving Station. A life-saving surfman at the station was patrolling the beach when he came across Charles Pitts on the beach, and he was then brought to the station. He eventually recovered and returned sailing on the Great Lakes. In the end, 22 people on board lost their lives. There are a lot of theories about what caused the Cypress to sink when she did, but the most likely explanation is that the Cypress's hatches were not covered in tarps, which made it easier for water to enter the ship. And as the freighter George Stephenson followed the Cypress, her captain noticed that the Cypress was trailing a red wake, which meant that when the waves broke over her deck and poured into her hold, water was mixing with her iron ore cargo, which only got discharged by her pumps, which left the ship vulnerable to the storm. The wreck of the Cypress was discovered in August of 2007 by members of the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society, approximately 8 miles from the shore of Deer Park, Michigan, in about 460 feet of water at the bottom of Lake Superior. Today, the story of the Cypress is mostly forgotten, and is one of the strangest mysteries of Lake Superior. A little over a year after the loss of the Cypress, another freighter went down on Lake Superior. The DM Clemson is the largest shipwreck in Lake Superior that remains undiscovered as of the making of this video. Labeled hull number 510, the DM Clemson was constructed in 1903 by the Superior Shipbuilding Company in Superior, Wisconsin for the Providence Steamship Company. When she was launched in July of 1903, she was one of the largest vessels on the Great Lakes. She measured 468 feet, or 143 meters in length. She had a beam of 52 feet, or 16 meters, and came in at 5,531 gross tons. She entered service on August 14, 1903, and her short career was relatively uneventful. But then, in September of 1905, just 2 years into her career, the Clemson was caught in the middle of a massive storm on Lake Superior. During the storm, the freighter was battered by heavy winds and waves, and she lost numerous hatch covers that caused the ship to take on a huge amount of water. As a result, when she made it to Two Harbors, Minnesota 3 days behind schedule, she had a 4-foot list to port. Then, just 3 years later, on September 26, 1908, while the freighter was docking in Buffalo, New York, she ran aground. She was freed shortly afterward, but then ran aground again not long afterward. She was once again freed and continued her voyage. Then, on October 28, while she was entering the harbor of Ashtabula, Ohio, she collided with the lighthouse pier. The collision damaged 10 hull plates and one of her starboard water tanks. Fortunately, all of the damage occurred above the waterline, and temporary repairs were made until the ship could be fully repaired at the end of the season. And for the next several weeks, she continued sailing on the lakes. On the morning of November 20th, 1908, the DM Clemson, under the command of Captain Sam Chamberlain, departed Duluth with a load of 8,000 tons of iron ore bound for Ashtabula, which was the first leg of her final voyage of the season. However, only a few hours after she cleared Duluth, the Clemson found herself in the midst of a violent November gale. Massive waves swept the entire length of the ship, and water poured into her hull. On top of that, every time a wave washed over the ship, the freighter was covered in a thick layer of ice. The Clemson fought her way through the storm for the next 2 days, but fortunately, the ship held her own, and when the storm cleared, she made her way to the Sioux Locks. When the ship arrived at the Sioux, she was almost completely covered in ice, which her crew went to work clearing away. Afterward, she continued her voyage to Ashtabula, where her cargo of iron ore was unloaded. On the evening of November 27th, she went to Lorain to pick up a load of coal for her return voyage to Duluth. However, before she took on her cargo of coal in Lorain, Ohio, Captain Chamberlain inspected the Clemson's hull, as it was clear that her hull had been heavily strained in the storm. However, he could not find any damage in the ship's hull, and he said that she was seaworthy enough to make her final run. On November 29th, the Clemson took on her cargo of coal for her return voyage to Duluth. Loading was finished that night, and the Clemson departed Lorain for her final voyage of the season. She arrived at the Sioux on the morning of December 1st. Another freighter was also passing through the locks not far behind the Clemson. The relatively new freighter J.J. Brown was also passing through the locks on their final voyage of the season. When both ships reached Whitefish Bay, the crew of the J.J. Brown set a course for the open lake. Since their ship was empty, it would be harder to control the ship, and the storm would push them toward the rugged shoreline. On the other hand, since the DM Clemson was stabilized with her load of coal, her crew set a course that would have the ship hug Lake Superior's shore, a decision that almost every captain would have made. Within a few hours, the crew of the J.J. Brown found themselves in the midst of a fierce storm on Lake Superior. Despite the fact that their ship was empty and riding high, monstrous waves easily crashed over the deck, which allowed water to pour into her cargo holds. Soon, the captain of the J.J. Brown ordered the engines to be shut down and allow the ship to ride with the storm for the next 12 hours. But luckily, the freighter held her own in the storm. After battling her way through the storm for the next 2 days, she made it to Duluth. When she docked, her crew waited anxiously to see if the DM Clemson survived the storm, but she never arrived. On December 2nd, the freighter Algonquin, the same ship that last saw the ill-fated Bannockburn before she vanished on Lake Superior a few years earlier, passed through a large debris field on Lake Superior. It was unclear to her crew which ship the debris was from, but it was unlikely that whatever ship it came from survived the storm. When the Algonquin reached the Sioux Locks the next day, her captain reported the sighting and was passed on to the U.S. Lifesaving Service. As the DM Clemson became seriously overdue in arriving in Duluth, it was clear that the vessel did not survive the storm. More and more debris with the name DM Clemson were found by passing ships and on the shore of Lake Superior. 5 bodies from the ship were found, but only 2 of them could be identified. One of them was the Clemson's watchman, Simon Dunn, and the other was second mate Charles Woods. The rest of her crew were never found. On December 2nd, the search was called off for the season. The wreck of the DM Clemson remains undiscovered as of the release of this video. Some theorize that the temporary repairs that were made after her collision with the Ashtabula lighthouse failed in the heavy seas. But unfortunately, without any survivors or witness testimony, the real cause of her sinking remains unknown. Then, in 1917, Just 9 years after the ship went missing, another freighter with the exact same name entered service. The new DM Clemson sailed the Great Lakes for over 6 decades until she was scrapped in 1980. The story of the original DM Clemson is all but forgotten, and until her wreck is found, the cause of her sinking will remain a mystery. Constructed in 1909 by the Detroit Shipbuilding Company in Wyandotte, Michigan for the Capital Transportation Company, the Benjamin Noble was built as a canal freighter designed to traverse the locks of the St. Lawrence River. Her design was much different from other similarly sized freighters at the time. Forward and aft deckhouses were elevated. She was designed to transport cargo such as railroad rails, stone, and coal. The vessel was launched on April 28, 1909, and she entered service later that year. She measured 239 feet, or 73 meters in length, and came in at 1,481 gross tons. She was equipped with 2 cargo booms, both forward and aft, which made it easier for her to load and unload cargo. The freighter was named after one of her owner's primary investors. The Benjamin Noble had several design flaws that would contribute to her sinking a few years later. Her spar deck was extremely low, meaning that when fully loaded, she had very little freeboard. As a result, even if the ship was sailing through a mild storm, waves would easily wash over her deck. The sides of her deck were also equipped with large scuppers that would drain any water off the ship, but it could also lead to more water flooding her deck and pour into her cargo holds if a hatch cover came loose. With all these factors in mind, the Benjamin Noble would be more prone to taking on water even in a mild storm. But still, like most lake freighters at the time, she was frequently pushed to her limits, and her short career was relatively uneventful. In April 1914, 31-year-old John Eisenhart was placed in command of the Benjamin Noble. At the time, he was the youngest captain on the Great Lakes, and the Benjamin Noble was his first command. At the same time, the U.S. economy was in recession. As a result, many freighters remained laid up well after the start of the season. But soon, the Benjamin Noble set out on her first run of the season. She arrived in Conneaut, Ohio on April 16, 1914 to take on her cargo of railroad rails from the Cambria Steel Company. For the next 6 days, the rails were loaded into the freighter, and the ship sat so deep in the water that some of her crew, including Captain Eisenhart, knew that their ship had taken on more than she could handle. But as captain, it would be difficult for him to remove any of the cargo without putting his career in jeopardy. Soon, he decided that his ship couldn't take any more cargo. There were 2 more rail cars on the pier ready to be loaded, but soon, the Noble departed Conneaut bound for Duluth, Minnesota on April 22, 1914. As she departed, someone took a photo of the ship, showing how low she sat in the water, but for the next several days, the voyage was routine. Soon, the Benjamin Noble arrived at the Sioux, but after she passed through the locks and entered Whitefish Bay, a gale warning was issued, and warning flags were hoisted at the weather signal tower at the Sioux locks. If Captain Eisenhart of the Noble had seen the warning, he would have sought shelter near the Sioux. Not long after the Noble entered Lake Superior, she was joined by another freighter, the wooden-hulled lumber freighter Norwalk. Unfortunately, not long afterward, the 2 freighters found themselves in the midst of a punishing nor'easter, which brought heavy winds and waves. Cities on Lake Superior's western shore were thrown into chaos. On top of that, the Southern Lighthouse Pier at the entrance to Duluth Harbor was knocked out in the storm. A keeper ran out to restore the light, but then, a wave washed over the pier and he was swept away. Now, the Duluth Ship Canal was only marked by the lighthouse on the northern pier, which made it difficult to navigate the narrow canal without crashing into the pier. The freighter Minneapolis had just barely cleared Duluth when the storm began. She turned around, only to realize that only one lighthouse marked the canal, but luckily the ship made it safely back to Duluth without running aground. However, the Benjamin Noble, staying low in the water due to her heavy cargo, only made about 8 knots, and waves easily crashed over the deck. On the other hand, the Norwalk was handling the storm much better than the Noble, and soon the freighter sailed past the Noble. Both ships were still in sight one another as they plowed through the storm. When night fell, the crew of the Norwalk could see the lights of the Noble in the storm, but soon the lights disappeared. The captain of the Norwalk assumed that a squall hid the ship from view, and the Norwalk continued fighting her way through the storm. Fortunately, on the morning of April 28th, the Norwalk made it to Duluth. Her crew thought that the Noble would arrive not long after they did, but she never arrived. A few hours before the Norwalk arrived in Duluth, the Daniel J. Moreau was also fighting her way through the storm when her captain saw the lights of 2 ships in the storm, which one of them was probably the Noble, and the other was the Norwalk. But then, one of the lights disappeared. Her captain also thought that a squall must have hid the lights from view, but as the days passed, the Benjamin Noble failed to arrive in Duluth, and concern that the ship didn't survive the storm began to grow. Over the next several days, debris from the ship washed ashore on Lake Superior's western shore. None of the bodies from the ship's crew were found. The wreck of the Benjamin Noble was discovered in October of 2004 using side-scan sonar. There are many theories about what caused the Benjamin Noble to sink, the most likely is that the ship was severely overloaded, which easily allowed waves to wash over her deck and pour into her cargo holds, sending the ship to the bottom of the lake in minutes. Today, the wreck of the Benjamin Noble lies only 20 miles from Duluth in over 300 feet of water at the bottom of Lake Superior. In the early morning hours of November 6, 1918, the freighter Chester A. Congdon departed Fort William, Ontario with a load of 380,000 bushels of wheat bound for Port McNicoll, Ontario on Georgian Bay. As she set out into Lake Superior, her crew were completely unaware of what lay on the horizon. Labeled hull number 74, she was constructed in 1907 by the Chicago Shipbuilding Company in South Chicago, Illinois for the Home Steamship Company based in Cleveland. When she was launched on August 29, 1907, she was originally named the Salt Lake City, and sailed her maiden voyage on September 19th. She measured 532 feet or 162 meters in length, and came in at 6,530 gross registered tons. In 1911, the Salt Lake City was sold to the Acme Transit Company, based in Lorain, Ohio, which operated the ship for just under a year until she was sold to the Continental Steamship Company in early 1912, and she was renamed the Chester A. Congdon, after Minnesota Representative Chester Adgate Congdon. For the next 6 years, the Chester A. Congdon enjoyed a relatively uneventful career, with a few exceptions. On August 10, 1912, while the ship was anchored about 4 miles north of Cana Island in a heavy fog bank on Lake Michigan, she drifted into a shoal, which damaged several of her hull plates. Then, in October 1915, she ran aground on Lake St. Clair near Grosse Pointe. Afterward, the ship took on a considerable amount of water, but she was repaired and returned to service. By 1918, there was no reason to think that the Congdon's career would end anytime soon. At 2:30 a.m. on the morning of November 6, 1918, the Chester A. Congdon, under the command of Captain Charles Otterson, departed Fort William, Ontario with a load of 380,000 bushels of wheat bound for Port McNicoll, Ontario on Georgian Bay. The first couple hours of the voyage were routine, but then, just before 4 a.m., the Congdon found herself in the midst of a violent November gale. Captain Otterson diverted his ship to seek shelter closer to the shore. After the ship made it to calmer waters, she dropped anchor and sat idle for a few hours. At just past 10 a.m., the winds had calmed, and the ship continued her voyage. But then, not long afterward, a heavy fog bank descended over the freighter, and her crew reduced her speed to 9 knots. She continued sailing for another few hours, until just after 1 p.m., when in the fog, the ship suddenly came to a halt. The Congdon had run aground on the reef just north of Isle Royale. After the ship ran aground, her crew launched some of her lifeboats, and made their way to Passage Island just a few miles away. The ship apparently didn't have wireless on board, or it was damaged when the ship ran aground, so her crew had no way to send a distress signal. Soon, word of the disaster made it to shore, and several vessels were sent to rescue the crew of the stranded freighter. Fortunately, all of her crew made it off the ship and made it to shore. Afterward, there were several attempts to salvage the ship, but due to the bad weather, and the ship heavily laden with her cargo of grain, these attempts were unsuccessful. A few days later, on November 9th, the Congdon, still aground on the reef, broke in two, and her stern sank beneath the surface, while the bow was still afloat. Some of her grain cargo and the crew's belongings were retrieved, before it too sank beneath the surface. Although there were no casualties, the Chester A. Congdon was declared a total loss, and she remains one of the most costly maritime disasters on the Great Lakes. Fur trapper Louis Coutu was walking near the mouth of the Agawa River on Lake Superior in December of 1928 when he noticed something floating in the icy waters. He realized it was a bottle. He picked it up and realized it had a message inside. The message read, "I am the last one left alive, freezing and starving to death on Isle Royale and Lake Superior. I just want Mom and Dad to know my fate." The message was from Alice Bettridge, who was an assistant stewardess on the ill-fated package freighter Kamloops. She was constructed in 1924 by the Furness Shipbuilding Company in Durham, England for the Canada Steamship Lines, or CSL for short. She was launched on May 20th, 1924, and entered service a few months later. She measured 250 feet, or 76 meters in length, and came in at 2,402 gross tons. She was designed to traverse the locks of the St. Lawrence River and Welland Ship Canal, and deliver cargo to ports that were inaccessible to larger freighters. She was named after the city in British Columbia. In July of 1924, the Kamloops sailed across the North Atlantic Ocean bound for Montreal. For the next 3 years, she transported general cargo all over the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence River. She often sailed weeks or months after many ships on the lakes were laid up for the winter, in order to generate as much profit as possible, until one of her late-season runs brought the ship to a mysterious end. Under the command of Captain William Bryan, the Kamloops departed Port Colborne, Ontario on the morning of December 1st, 1927, with a load of salt, construction supplies, and paper-making machinery parts. The weather forecast predicted that ships on the Great Lakes would encounter rough weather. But since meteorology at the time was still in its infancy, the storm's intensity was anyone's guess. So the Kamloops continued sailing north, hoping to finish her last run of the season as quickly as possible. The weather was calm as the freighter sailed through Lake Erie and Lake Huron, but after they passed through the Sioux Locks and entered Lake Superior on December 4th, it was clear that a storm was on its way. After the Kamloops passed through the Sioux, she and several other vessels dropped anchor and decided that it was best to wait out the storm in Whitefish Bay. The Kamloops remained anchored in Whitefish Bay for the next 2 days, but the storm only intensified. Concerned that they wouldn't finish their run, the Kamloops and a few other ships nearby decided that if they wanted to complete their voyage, it was now or never. Soon the Kamloops was joined by another freighter, the Quedagh, as they steamed through the maelstrom. Both vessels plowed forward, but the storm only grew worse, and the Quedagh soon lost sight of the Kamloops in the storm. They were now sailing blind. On the night of December 6th, the captain of the Quedagh knew that they were sailing dangerously close to the rugged shoreline of Isle Royale. One of the lookouts shouted to the captain that the rocks of Isle Royale were just ahead. Realizing that they were only moments away from hitting the rocks, the captain grabbed the ship's wheel and turned hard to starboard. Narrowly, the Quedagh avoided hitting the rocks of Isle Royale. Shortly afterward, the captain looked back to see if the Kamloops was still behind them, but he could just barely make out the ship's lights in the whiteout conditions. Fearing that the Kamloops would run aground on the rocks, the Quedagh sounded her foghorn, before the Kamloops suddenly disappeared in the storm. Afterward, the captain shifted his attention back to keeping his ship and his crew safe. Unfortunately, the Quedagh survived the storm and made it to Port Arthur, Ontario. After the Kamloops failed to arrive in port on her scheduled date of arrival, there wasn't much concern about the ship. It was widely believed that the ship ran aground in the storm or found a place to ride out the storm. But soon, the Kamloops became seriously overdue, and on December 12th, a search was sent out to find any traces of the freighter. Over the next few months, debris and bodies of the ship's crew were found on Isle Royale. But then, in December of 1928, almost a full year after the ship went missing, a message in a bottle was found by fur trapper Louis Coutu in the Agawa River. The message read, "I am the last one left alive, breathing and starving to death on Isle Royale in Lake Superior. I just want Mom and Dad to know my fate." Soon, it was confirmed that the message was from Alice Bettridge, who was a 23-year-old assistant stewardess on the Kamloops. No other traces of the ship were found for nearly half a century, until the wreck of the Kamloops was discovered on August 21st, 1977. She lies on her starboard side, just northeast of Isle Royale, at the bottom of Lake Superior. There are quite a few theories about what caused the Kamloops to sink when she did, but without any survivors or witness testimony, we may never know what happened to the Kamloops and her 22 crew when their ship surrendered to Lake Superior. Lake Huron is the second largest of the Great Lakes by surface area and the third largest by volume. Lake Huron also has the longest shoreline out of the other 4 Great Lakes, and it has the most islands. But just like the other lakes, Lake Huron has a deadly reputation. Hundreds of ships have met their ends in the waters of Lake Huron, and the vast majority of them remain undiscovered as of the making of this video. Here are 5 horrible shipwrecks on Lake Huron. On the evening of October 19, 1905, Captain John Duddleson of the bulk freighter L.C. Waldo found himself in the midst of a fierce gale on Lake Huron when he spotted another freighter off in the distance. It was the nearly 20-year-old steamer Caliuga, barely making headway in the storm. But little did anybody know, this would be the last time anyone would see the Caliuga. As of the making of this video, her wreck remains undiscovered. The Caliuga was a wooden-hulled ore carrier constructed in 1887 by the Simon Langle Shipyard in St. Clair, Michigan, and was launched on September 24, 1887. She came in at 1,941 gross tons and measured 270 feet or 82 meters in length. She was named after the term Kali Yuga in Hinduism, which refers to the final of 4 ages of the world, which is considered to be the worst of the 4, and it roughly translates to Age of Darkness. In 1892, the Kali Yuga was sold to the Cleveland Iron Mining Company, which operated the vessel until 1901 when she was sold to the St. Clair Steamship Company. However, her 18-year-long career wasn't without incident. On August 5, 1895, while the freighter was sailing through a fog bank in northern Lake Huron, she grounded on Bois Blanc Island. 2 tugboats released the ship the following day. On July 24, 1897, she ran aground on Ballard Reef in the Detroit River, but she was soon released. Then, on August 4, 1900, while the freighter was towing a barge called the Fontana, the steamer Appomattox was passing by the Caliuga while towing a barge called the Santiago. While both barges were under tow by both freighters, the Fontana collided with the Santiago, and the Fontana quickly sank, killing one of her crew members. And then, just 3 months later, on November 4, 1900, the Caliuga ran aground once again in the Detroit River. 3 days later, she was freed by several tugboats. By 1905, there was no way the Caliuga could compete with the new steel-hulled lake freighters, but she still played an important role transporting iron ore and other raw materials throughout the region. On the afternoon of October 18, 1905, the Caliuga departed Marquette, Michigan with a load of iron ore bound for Erie, Pennsylvania. However, after the freighter passed through the Sioux Locks and entered Lake Huron the next day, a violent gale swept over the lake. Unfortunately for the Caliuga, the storm hit only after she reached the open lake, with no safe place nearby for her to ride out the storm. Around 4 p.m., while the Caliuga was fighting her way through the storm, she was spotted by the steamer Frontenac, around 7 miles east of Presque Isle, Michigan. Then, around sunset, she was spotted by Captain John Duddleson of the freighter L.C. Waldo, between Middle Island and Thunder Bay Island. Little did anybody know, this would be the last time the Caliuga would be seen again. On October 26, a steamer was sailing through Georgian Bay on Lake Huron when they came across the Caliuga's pilot house. Several bodies from the ship were found over the next few weeks, but as of the making of this video, the wreck of the Caliuga remains undiscovered. There are a lot of theories about how the ship went down, but no one knows for sure, and the story of the Caliuga is mostly forgotten today. The Great Lakes Storm of 1913 is by far the deadliest storm in the history of the Great Lakes. 19 ships went down in the storm, and 19 others were stranded in the storm. Over 270 sailors lost their lives. Lake Huron experienced the worst of the storm. Over the course of just a few hours on November 9, 1913, Lake Huron claimed 8 ships and the lives of nearly 180 sailors. Perhaps the most remarkable shipwreck during the storm was the bulk freighter Isaac M. Scott. Labeled Yard Number 369, the Isaac M. Scott was constructed in 1909 by the American Shipbuilding Company in Lorain, Ohio for the Virginia Steamship Company, based in Cleveland. The vessel was launched on June 12, 1909, and was completed in early July. She came in at 6,372 gross tons and measured 504 feet or 154 meters in length. She entered service on July 2, 1909, but on her maiden voyage, she ran into trouble. On July 12, 1909, while sailing through a heavy fog bank on Whitefish Bay, she collided with the ore carrier John B. Cowell. The Scott tore a massive hole in the side of the Cowell, and the ship rapidly sank, killing 14 out of the 24 people on board the Cowell. The bow of the Scott was heavily damaged following the collision, but she was repaired and returned to service. But just a few years later, the ship would meet her own tragic fate. In the pre-dawn hours of November 9, 1913, the Isaac M. Scott, under the command of Captain Archie MacArthur, departed Cleveland with a load of coal bound for Milwaukee. She and several other ships soon left the St. Clair River and entered Lake Huron, but then the crew of the Scott found themselves sailing through the worst of the storm which had been raging for the past several days. On the afternoon of November 9th, as the Isaac M. Scott entered Lake Huron, she was spotted by Captain A.C. May of the freighter H.B. Hoggett, which ended up grounding on the beach at Port Edward, Ontario near the mouth of the St. Clair River, but luckily the Hoggett survived the storm. Captain May was the last person to see the Isaac M. Scott for over 6 decades. After the storm cleared, debris from the ship and bodies of the ship's crew washed ashore on the Canadian side of Lake Huron. None of the 27 crew on board the Scott survived, but the ship was just one of several ships claimed by Lake Huron during the storm. The wreck of the Isaac M. Scott was discovered in 1976 by diver Kent Bell Richard about 6 miles north of Thunder Bay Island, lying upside down in over 200 feet of water at the bottom of Lake Huron. Just 2 days after the loss of the Isaac M. Scott, another vessel went down on Lake Huron during the storm of 1913. The bulk freighter Hydrus was also sailing through Lake Huron with a load of iron ore when the storm hit. Labeled Hull number 327, the freighter was constructed in 1903 by the American Shipbuilding Company in Lorain, Ohio for the Gilchrist Transportation Company. When she was launched on September 12, 1903, she was originally named the R.E. Shuck, after one of the founders of the Gilchrist Transportation Company, Randall E. Shuck. She came in at 4,713 gross tons and measured 436 feet or 133 meters in length. In 1913, the R.E. Shuck was sold to the Interlake Steamship Company and renamed Hydrus. On November 11, 1913, the Hydrus was sailing through Lake Huron with a cargo of iron ore from Duluth bound for Cleveland. She was sailing not far from another vessel, the Canadian freighter James Carruthers, which also went down the storm. And soon, the Hydrus disappeared in the storm. Not a single one of the 24 crew on board the Hydrus survived. On top of that, her sister ship, the Argus, also went down on Lake Huron with all hands during the storm of 1913. And for more than a century, the final resting place of the Hydrus remained unknown. The wreck of the Hydrus was discovered in 2015 by shipwreck hunter David Schroeder, sitting upright at the bottom of Lake Huron. Unfortunately, the Hydrus was just one of many ships claimed by the lakes during the storm of 1913, and not a single survivor from any of those ships lived to tell the tale. In 1892, the Cleveland Shipbuilding Company began construction on two nearly identical freighters for the Lake Superior Iron Company. One of them would be named the Choctaw, after the Southeast Native American tribe, and the other would be named the Andaste, which is the French word for the Susquehannock people. At the time of their construction, whaleback freighters were becoming very common on the Great Lakes. These two ships would combine the whaleback design with a standard bow, or in other words, they were semi-whaleback freighters. However, this design never caught on, and only 3 of these types of ships were ever built. The Andaste was launched on March 24, 1892, and the Choctaw was launched a few months later on May 25th. Both ships came in at 1,574 gross tons, and both measured 270 feet or 82 meters in length. The Choctaw sailed her maiden voyage in June of 1892, and in 1894, she and her sister ship were sold to the Cleveland Cliffs Iron Company, and her early career was relatively uneventful. But then, in May of 1896, she collided with the freighter L.C. Waldo, and partially sank near the Sioux Locks, but luckily she was refloated and repaired. But then, in 1900 and 1902, she ran aground and partially sank, but both times she was repaired and returned to service. On November 9, 1913, the Choctaw was docked in Marquette, Michigan, when her captain, Charles Fox, realized the signs of what would become the storm of 1913. That same day, he saw the ill-fated Henry B. Smith depart Marquette Harbor before she was lost with all hands in the storm. But less than 2 years later, the Choctaw would meet her own fate. On July 11, 1915, the Choctaw was carrying a load of coal from Cleveland bound for Marquette. After the ship passed through the St. Clair River and entered Lake Huron, a heavy fog bank descended over the freighter. Despite the fact that visibility was poor, Captain Fox did not order her speed reduced, and she continued full ahead. This was because, like many captains on the Great Lakes, Captain Fox of the Choctaw was under enormous pressure to deliver their cargo as quickly as possible no matter what. At the same time, another vessel, the 230-foot Canadian freighter Wakanda, was carrying a load of wheat from Fort William, Ontario bound for Montreal, when she found herself in the midst of a heavy fog bank. Her captain, Cornelius Deneen, was under the same pressure as Captain Fox of the Choctaw. At roughly 4:30 a.m. on the morning of July 12th, Captain Deneen was summoned to the bridge. When he arrived, his first mate reported that they heard the whistle of another ship in the fog, and it sounded close. The captain sounded 3 short blasts from the Wakanda's whistle, which the other ship answered. This repeated several more times until Captain Deneen realized that the ship was likely in their path. He ordered the engines full astern and turned the wheel hard to starboard, before suddenly the Choctaw emerged from the fog, and the Wakanda smashed into the other freighter between her first 2 cargo hatches. Soon the 2 ships parted from one another, and the Choctaw disappeared into the fog. Luckily, the Wakanda was not in danger of sinking, and the crew of the freighter searched for the Choctaw. Soon they heard the screams of men in the fog, before suddenly they saw the Choctaw with her stern rising out of the water as she foundered by the head. Captain Fox of the Choctaw almost immediately ordered an abandoned ship. The Choctaw had developed a port list as her bow sank beneath the surface. She soon rolled over onto her starboard side, and her stern briefly lifted out of the water before she slipped below the surface of Lake Huron. The Choctaw sank in only 17 minutes, but luckily all of her 22 crew survived and were picked up by the Wakanda. Following the disaster, the owners of the Choctaw filed a lawsuit against the owners of the Wakanda, claiming that the Wakanda was responsible for the collision. But it was pointed out that the Choctaw was sailing at full speed during the collision, and they did not correctly respond to the warnings from the Wakanda. And soon the court found both vessels equally at fault. Unfortunately, the Choctaw's sister ship, the Andaste, met her own fate less than 15 years later. On September 9, 1929, the ship was carrying a load of gravel from Ferrysburg, Michigan, bound for Chicago, when she was lost with all hands in a storm on Lake Michigan. The wreck of the Choctaw was discovered in May of 2017 by members of the Thunder Bay National Marine Sanctuary, nearly 102 years after she went down. The wreck lies on her starboard side at a depth of around 300 feet at the bottom of Lake Huron. However, the wreck of her sister ship, the Andaste, remains undiscovered as of the making of this video. Just a few years after the loss of the Choctaw, another vessel went down on Lake Huron in very similar circumstances. Labeled hull number 346, the D.R. Hannah was constructed in 1906 by the American Shipbuilding Company in Lorain, Ohio for the Pioneer Steamship Company based in Cleveland. She was launched on October 20, 1906 and entered service on November 12. She was one of the largest freighters on the lakes at the time. She measured 552 feet or 168 meters in length and came in at 7,023 gross tons. She was operated by a crew of 31. Her early career was relatively uneventful, but then, on September 1, 1910, the Hannah collided with the steamer Harvey H. Brown. Luckily, both ships survived the collision, but the Brown was so heavily damaged that she did not sail for the rest of the shipping season. Then, on October 13, 1915, while the Hannah was entering Cleveland Harbor, her foremast was knocked over by the Superior Avenue high-level bridge. Her foremast was replaced in Detroit. On May 19, 1916, the Hannah ran aground on the St. Mary's River near Little Rapids Cut after her steering equipment failed. Then, on September 6, 1918, the Hannah ran aground on Detour Shoal on Lake Huron while carrying a load of iron ore, but luckily she was once again freed and returned to service. On May 16, 1919, the DR Hannah was carrying a load of 377,000 bushels of wheat from Duluth bound for Buffalo, New York, when she was overtaken by a dense fog bank on Lake Huron. At the same time, another vessel, the freighter Quincy A. Shaw, was sailing upbound on Lake Huron with a cargo of coal, when they also found themselves in heavy fog. Soon, the crew of the Quincy A. Shaw noticed the DR Hannah directly in their path, and soon, the Shaw collided with the Hannah, and the Hannah quickly rolled over and sank. Fortunately, all of her crew survived the sinking, but the Hannah was declared a total loss. The wreck of the Hannah rests upside down in roughly 135 feet of water at the bottom of Lake Huron, and is one of the largest wrecks at the bottom of Lake Huron. And today, the story of the Hannah is all but forgotten. Lake Michigan is the third largest of the Great Lakes by surface area, and the second largest by volume. Lake Michigan is also the only Great Lake that is entirely within the United States. But Lake Michigan is also the deadliest Great Lake in terms of drownings. Every year, nearly half of all people who drown in the Great Lakes drown on Lake Michigan. Mainly because of its interesting geography that creates dangerous rip currents near the shore, and massive waves that can appear out of nowhere and hit one after another, especially near beaches. But Lake Michigan is also one of the deadliest Great Lakes in terms of shipwrecks as well. Here are 5 shipwrecks that were lost with all hands on Lake Michigan. On October 26, 1892, the relatively new freighter W.H. Gilcher departed Buffalo, New York with a load of 3,080 tons of coal bound for Milwaukee, but little did anybody know, the W.H. Gilcher would never make it to her destination. Labeled Hull Number 10, the W.H. Gilcher was constructed in 1890 by the Cleveland Shipbuilding Company for 3 Ohio lumber merchants. She was nearly identical to another ship being built nearby, the Western Reserve, which was also being constructed for those 3 men. I have a video about the Western Reserve if you want to learn more. The W.H. Gilcher and her sister ship were some of the first lake freighters with steel hulls rather than iron or wood. The W.H. Gilcher was launched on December 10, 1890, and entered service in March of 1891. She came in at 2,414 gross tons and measured 302 feet or 92 meters in length. For the next 2 years, the W.H. Gilcher and her sister ship transported various raw materials throughout the Great Lakes, and her brief career was mostly uneventful. On October 26, 1892, the Gilcher, under the command of Captain Leeds Weeks, departed Buffalo, New York bound for Milwaukee with a load of 3,080 tons of coal. The weather was calm for the first half of the voyage, but after she passed through the Straits of Mackinac and entered Lake Michigan on October 28th, a massive storm swept over the lake. When the storm cleared on October 30th, several ships arrived in port behind schedule. But the W.H. Gilcher never arrived in Milwaukee. On the evening of October 28th, the captain of a nearby schooner claimed to have seen a vessel matching the W.H. Gilcher fighting her way through the storm in northern Lake Michigan. A few weeks after her disappearance, several passing ships found debris from the Gilcher, and a few bodies of the ship's crew were found washed ashore. But as of the making of this video, the wreck of the W.H. Gilcher remains undiscovered. On November 22, 1912, the nearly 45-year-old schooner Rouse Simmons departed Thompson, Michigan with a load of 5,000 Christmas trees bound for the churches and orphanages of Chicago. Unfortunately, a November gale soon swept over Lake Michigan, and the aging schooner disappeared with all hands in the storm, not to be discovered until nearly 6 decades later. The Rouse Simmons was constructed in 1868 by the Allen, McClellan & Company shipyard in Milwaukee and was launched on August 27, 1868. Named after a prominent Kenosha businessman, the Rouse Simmons came in at 205 gross tons and measured 124 feet or 37 meters in length. She was a wooden-hulled, 3-masted schooner designed to transport lumber between Chicago and various ports on Lake Michigan. In 1870, the vessel was purchased by lumber magnate Charles Hackley, and she would make almost weekly trips transporting lumber between Grand Haven, Michigan and Chicago. However, by the 1890s, there was a growing popularity of decorating pine or evergreen trees for Christmas in the United States. So during the holiday season, the Simmons would also transport Christmas trees to Chicago, where people could go on board the vessel and choose a tree. And the vessel continued to do so for the next 20 years. On November 22, 1912, the Rouse Simmons was loaded with approximately 5,000 evergreen trees in Thompson, Michigan, bound for the churches and orphanages of Chicago. However, as soon as she left port, a November gale began building over Lake Michigan, and that same storm sank 3 other ships as well. At roughly 3 p.m. the next day, a vessel that was believed to be the Simmons was spotted by a local life-saving station, with a distress flag hoisted. A life-saving boat was deployed to reach the schooner, but the bad weather prevented them from reaching the ship, and the vessel soon disappeared into the storm. It's still unknown as to whether the ship was the Simmons or not, but it's unlikely that whatever ship it was survived the storm. A few days later, the Simmons was reported overdue in arriving in Chicago. Upon hearing the news, the family of the ship's captain, Herman Schunemann, knew that the ship had been lost in the storm. Over the next few months, the remains of Christmas trees washed ashore on the eastern shore of Lake Michigan. In honor of the Simmons and her crew, the following year, 1913, a large Christmas tree was erected on the lakefront in Chicago. Over 100,000 people attended. Other schooners continued delivering Christmas trees to Chicago during the holiday season for the next decade or so, but due to the age of the ships, they were deemed unsafe to sail on, and they were quickly pulled from service and scrapped. And this essentially diminished the practice of Christmas tree ships until 2000 when the Coast Guard cutter Mackinac docked at Chicago's Navy Pier to deliver thousands of Christmas trees to the city, both in honor of the Rouse Simmons and to keep the tradition alive, which they still do to this day. The wreck of the Rouse Simmons was discovered in 1971 sitting upright in roughly 170 feet of water at the bottom of Lake Michigan. Most of the ship's hull is still intact, and the remains of her cargo of Christmas trees can still be found in her holds. Even today, the cause of her sinking remains a mystery, and her story is mostly forgotten, but still lives in the memory of many Chicago residents to this day. In late October of 1929, around the same time that the stock market crash plunged the United States into the Great Depression, 3 ships met their end on Lake Michigan. On October 29th, the 204-foot iron-hulled package freighter Wisconsin was sailing from Chicago bound for Milwaukee when she sprang a leak in a storm and sank with a loss of 9 out of the 68 people on board. Just 2 days later, on Halloween, the 410-foot freighter Senator collided with the steamer Marquette in heavy fog, around 20 miles northeast of Port Washington, Wisconsin. Out of the 28 people on board, 9 lost their lives. But just a few days before these 2 ships went down, the car ferry Milwaukee went down in a storm on Lake Michigan after departing her namesake port. All 46 people on board lost their lives. Labeled hull number 413, the vessel was constructed in 1902 by the American Shipbuilding Company in Lorain, Ohio for the Manistee, Marquette, and Northern Railroad Company based in Manistee, Michigan. At the time of her construction, car ferries were becoming vital for railroad companies on the Great Lakes. These are not the types of car ferries that transport people and their automobiles across a short stretch of water. These types of car ferries were designed to carry railroad cars and occasionally passengers across the Great Lakes. These ships had several railroad tracks inside that would allow the cars to be loaded onto the ship through the stern. And after reaching their destination on the other side of the lake, they would be offloaded and continue their trip. Car ferries were also designed to sail as late into the season as possible, meaning that they had to have reinforced hulls, and their engines had to produce more power than the underpowered lake freighters. The Milwaukee was one of those car ferries. When she was launched on December 6, 1902, she was originally named the Manistee, Marquette, and Northern No. 1. She came in at 2,933 gross tons and measured 388 feet or 118 meters in length. In 1909, the Manistee, Marquette, and Northern No. 1 was sold to the Grand Trunk Milwaukee Car Ferry Company and was renamed Milwaukee, and for the next 2 decades, she enjoyed a relatively uneventful career. But that all changed on October 22, 1929, when the Milwaukee, under the command of Captain Robert McKay, departed her namesake port with a load of 25 railroad cars bound for Grand Haven, Michigan. However, before the ship even left port, Lake Michigan was being overtaken by a massive storm. Despite this, Captain McKay, who was known as a heavy weather captain, decided to leave port nonetheless, eager to keep on schedule. Several other ships decided to stay in port and wait out the storm, knowing that the storm was more than they could handle. As the Milwaukee reached the open lake, she battled gale-force winds and massive waves. At around 3:45 p.m., the ferry was spotted by the U.S. lightship No. 95, around 3 miles east of the port of Milwaukee. The crew of the lightship saw the ferry pitching and rolling heavily in the storm, and massive waves crashed over her deck. The crew of the lightship saw the ferry being tossed about in the storm for around 10 minutes before she vanished into the heavy rain and fog. But little did anybody know, this would be the last time anyone would see the Milwaukee for over 4 decades. When the Milwaukee failed to arrive in Grand Haven, Michigan when the storm cleared, there wasn't much concern since travel delays and storms were common. It wasn't until 36 hours after the Milwaukee was due to arrive in Grand Haven that a search was organized to find any traces of the ship. On October 24th, a rescue plane was sent out to search the area in which the ship was supposed to sail through, but they didn't find any traces of the ship or her crew. But soon, debris from the ship and bodies of the ship's crew washed ashore. Just north of Racine, Wisconsin, 4 men were discovered near the shore, 2 of them wearing life jackets bearing the words Milwaukee. On October 26, a lifeboat from the Milwaukee was found near Holland, Michigan with the bodies of 4 of her crew members. But then, the next day, October 27th, a message box from the Milwaukee was discovered on a beach near Grand Haven. Inside was a rolled-up message from one of the ship's pursers. The message read, SS Milwaukee, October 22nd, 1929. The ship is making water fast. We have turned around and headed for Milwaukee. Pumps are working, but Seagate is bent and can't keep water out. Flicker is flooded. Seas are tremendous. Things look bad. Crew roll is about the same as last payday. It was signed A.R. Sadin, purser. It was confirmed that it was the handwriting of the Milwaukee's purser, Albine R. Sadin. His body was discovered a few days before his message washed ashore. None of the estimated 52 people on board the Milwaukee survived the sinking, and only 15 bodies of the ship's victims were recovered. One of the bodies recovered was wearing a watch that stopped at 9:35 p.m., suggesting that it was around the time the ship began her final plunge. Following the disaster, an investigation was held to figure out what caused the ship to sink. Some speculated that the ship's owners forced Captain McKay to make the dangerous run, despite the heavy weather. However, the company quickly refuted these claims by saying that they had provided weather reports to their other captains in Milwaukee at the time, and all their other ships remained in port when the storm hit. On top of that, in the summer of 1929, the Milwaukee passed all her physical inspections and was believed to be perfectly sound. In the end, it was concluded that the ship was simply overwhelmed by the force of the storm. The wreck of the Milwaukee was discovered in 1972 in roughly 125 feet of water at the bottom of Lake Michigan. She lies only 3 miles from her point of departure. After further examination of the wreck, it was found that during the storm, the ship's seagate had been damaged, which allowed tons of water to freely enter the ship. But in the end, the sinking of the Milwaukee remains one of the deadliest car fare disasters on the Great Lakes. On November 11, 1940, 2 huge storm systems merged over the Great Lakes, creating a massive gale that covered thousands of square miles. Lake Michigan experienced the worst of the storm. 2 fishing tugs and 3 massive freighters went down on Lake Michigan in the storm. Approximately 66 sailors lost their lives in the storm. Often referred to as the Armistice Day Storm, it was one of the deadliest storms in the history of the Great Lakes. The Canadian freighter Anna C. Minch was one of the several freighters claimed by Lake Michigan during the storm. Labeled hull number 415, the Anna C. Minch was constructed in 1903 by the American Shipbuilding Company in Lorain, Ohio for the Kinsman Transit Company, based in Cleveland, and was launched on April 18, 1903. She came in at 4,285 gross tons and measured 380 feet or 120 meters in length. However, over her nearly 4-decade-long career, she suffered more than a dozen groundings and collisions. On December 4, 1925, while carrying a load of coal, she became stranded at Fox Point on Lake Michigan. But after she was released by tugs the next day, she began taking on water, but the flooding was contained. In September of 1926, the Minch was sold to the Western Navigation Company based in Fort William, Ontario, and for the next 14 years, her career was relatively uneventful. On November 11, 1940, the Anna C. Minch, under the command of 55-year-old Captain Donald Kennedy, departed Fort William, Ontario with a load of grain bound for Chicago. The weather was calm as she sailed through the Straits of Mackinac, but soon, the storm system that had just passed over Chicago made its way into Lake Michigan. But to the crew of the Anna C. Minch, the storm was no cause for concern. However, the storm quickly intensified as blinding snow and 80-mile-per-hour winds swept over Lake Michigan. Many ships on Lake Michigan were caught off guard as they battled 20 to 30-foot waves as they fought their way through the storm. The Anna C. Minch found herself in a struggle for survival. Sometime that night, as the ship fought her way through the storm, the Minch broke in two, giving her crew only moments to escape. Not a single one of her 24 crew members survived, but the Anna C. Minch was not the only ship claimed by Lake Michigan that night. On November 11, 1940, the freighter William B. Davik was running a few hours ahead of the Anna C. Minch. Labeled hull number 26, the ship was constructed in 1907 by the Great Lakes Engineering Works shipyard in St. Clair, Michigan for the Vulcan Steamship Company. The ship was launched on September 25, 1907, and entered service a few weeks later. She was a decent size for her time, coming in at 4,468 gross tons and measured 420 feet or 130 meters in length. She was operated by a crew of 32. She was designed to carry iron ore from Lake Superior to Lake Erie and Lake Michigan and return with a cargo of coal. In October of 1915, the Davik was sold to the Interlake Steamship Company, and in the winter of 1922, the freighter underwent a major overhaul, which reduced her tonnage to 4,220 gross tons. Aside from that, her 3-decade-long career was relatively uneventful. On November 11, 1940, the Davik, under the command of Captain Charles Allen, was carrying a cargo of coal from Erie, Pennsylvania to Chicago. That afternoon, Captain Allen sent a message from the ship's radio telephone reporting the ship's position and mentioning that the weather was calm. But soon, Captain Allen and his ship would find themselves in a struggle for survival. Soon, the William B. Davick battled her way through 80-mile-per-hour winds and monstrous waves that repeatedly broke over her deck. As the ship lifted and fell in the waves, her propeller kept rising out of the water, which forced her crew to reduce power to prevent overspinning. But Captain Allen held out hope that his ship could survive the storm. But soon, as the ship fought her way through the maelstrom, her rudder abruptly turned hard to port and stopped responding to the wheel, causing the ship to suddenly veer to the side. Not long afterward, the rudder smashed into the propeller, and a huge vibration was felt throughout the ship, and she soon fell into a trough. By that point, her fate was sealed. The freighter rolled over and disappeared beneath the surface, taking all 32 of her crew with her. Her wreck was discovered in May of 1972, not far from the Anna C. Minch. The state of both wrecks offers some clues about what happened to both freighters in their final moments, but without any survivors, it is impossible to know for sure. Unfortunately, the Anna C. Minch and the William B. Davick were not the only freighters claimed by the storm. The Canadian freighter Novadoc was also fighting her way through the storm not far from both freighters. For a moment, Captain Stipe of the Novadoc spotted the Anna C. Minch before she vanished in the whiteout conditions. While battling her way through the storm, the Novadoc was never able to generate the power needed to maintain headway. Captain Stipe knew that his ship was sailing dangerously close to shore, and sometime that night, the Novadoc beached around 150 yards offshore, around 2 miles north of Little Point Sable. 2 crew tried to cross her open deck, but a massive wave swept over the ship, and they were swept away. But soon, the 17 survivors were rescued. Unfortunately, it was impossible for the Novadoc to be salvaged, and she remained on the beach until she was ripped apart by the punishing surf. In the end, 154 people lost their lives in the Armistice Day storm, including 66 sailors. To this day, it remains one of the deadliest storms in the history of the Great Lakes. In addition to the 5 shipwrecks we just covered, it's said that Lake Michigan had its own Bermuda Triangle. The Lake Michigan Triangle stretches between Manitowoc, Wisconsin, Ludington, and Benton Harbor, Michigan, and has had an unusual amount of disappearances. Numerous steel-hulled steamers, schooners, and aircraft have gone missing in the triangle since the 17th century. In fact, the very first shipwreck on the Great Lakes, the bark Le Griffon, designed by René Robert Cavier Sieur de La Salle, one of the first to explore the Great Lakes region, disappeared on Lake Michigan in September of 1679 after leaving Washington Island. On October 30th, 1921, the more than 50-year-old schooner Rosabelle departed High Island on northern Lake Michigan, bound for Benton Harbor with a load of potatoes and lumber, when a heavy fog bank descended over Lake Michigan. The next day, on Halloween, the car ferry Ann Arbor No. 4 came across the wreck of the Rosabelle, drifting around 15 miles off the coast of Kenosha, Wisconsin. Her crew was nowhere to be found, and her stern was heavily damaged. At first, it was thought that the damage was a result of a collision, but no other ship on the lake reported any collision. Soon, a steamer came to tow the ship to Racine, where she was beached to be salvaged. Even after several examinations of the wreck, it was unclear what caused the damage to the ship. No bodies of the ship's crew were ever found, and the wreck of the Roosevelt was eventually scrapped. And then, on June 23, 1950, Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 2501 was flying from New York City to Seattle when she vanished over Lake Michigan with 58 people on board. But these are just a handful of the many unusual mysteries of the Lake Michigan Triangle, and we may never know the full stories of the sailors who lost their lives in the area. Lake Erie is the second smallest Great Lake by surface area and the smallest by volume. Lake Erie's average depth is only 62 feet, and its deepest point is only 210. But Lake Erie also has the highest density of shipwrecks per square mile than the other 4 lakes. During a storm, the shallow waters of the lake produce massive waves out of nowhere and hit with punishing force. It's estimated that there are between 5,000 and 2,000 shipwrecks at the bottom of Lake Erie, and most of them remain undiscovered. Here are 5 Erie shipwrecks on Lake Erie. On June 16, 1850, the relatively new paddle steamer G.P. Griffith departed Buffalo, New York with over 300 passengers on board bound for Toledo, Ohio. However, unbeknownst to the passengers of the steamer, in just a few hours, they would be in a fight for their lives. Constructed in 1848 in Maumee, Ohio, the G.P. Griffith was a wooden-hulled side-wheel paddle steamer designed to carry passengers and cargo throughout the Great Lakes. Named after a local businessman, the Griffith came in at 587 gross tons and measured 193 feet or 59 meters in length. She entered service in 1848, and her short career was mostly uneventful. But on October 17, 1849, the Griffith collided with the Canadian schooner California near Cleveland. While the Griffith suffered no serious damage from the collision, the California had been heavily damaged and had drifted ashore. But the Griffith was repaired and returned to service. But just a few months later, her career would come to a catastrophic end. On June 16, 1850, the Griffith departed Buffalo, New York, bound for Toledo, Ohio, with over 300 passengers on board. On the way, she would stop in Erie, Pennsylvania, Fairport, Ohio, and Cleveland before making her way to Toledo. That night was calm, and most of the passengers decided to sleep on the hurricane deck rather than in their cabins. At around 3 a.m. on the morning of June 17th, the ship's wheelsman was on duty when he noticed sparks coming from the ship's funnel. He alerted the first mate, and some of the crew tried to extinguish the fire with buckets of water, but the flames wouldn't go out. Soon the fire alarm was sounded, and many passengers navigated through the smoke-filled hallways to reach the boat deck. The ship's captain had calculated that they were only a few miles from shore, and he hoped that the ship could be beached. Acting quickly, he ordered the ship to sail full steam ahead to beach her, in order to allow the passengers a safe exit from the burning ship. However, the movement of the ship only fanned the flames, and caused the fire to spread toward the stern. On top of that, her forward motion made it impossible for the smoldered lifeboats to be launched. Soon the ship was completely engulfed in flames, meaning anybody still on the ship had nowhere to run. The crew and the passengers used whatever they could to put out the flames, but it was no use. Soon there was an aggressive lurch, and the steamer came to a stop. The passengers assumed that they made it to the beach, but they found out that they had actually run aground on a sandbar about half a mile offshore. By this point, the crew and passengers' only hope of survival was to jump from the ship, swim for the shore, and hope for the best. The Griffith was unable to free itself from the sandbar, and as the passengers jumped from the deck, some of them got sucked into the paddle wheel, which was still turning, and were crushed immediately. Local residents could see the flames from the ship in the distance, which lit up the night sky. Soon the bodies of the victims washed ashore, and the Griffith was nothing more than a smoldered hulk of its former self. And eventually, she drifted off the sandbar and slipped beneath the surface. In the end, out of the 326 passengers and crew on board that night, 286 of them lost their lives. To this day, it remains the deadliest shipwreck on Lake Erie. On June 28, 1899, the nearly 12-year-old steam barge Margaret Olwell departed Kelly's Island on Lake Erie with a load of limestone bound for Cleveland, a voyage she had done many times throughout her career. Unbeknownst to the crew, however, a rare early summer storm would soon pass over the lake, and the Olwell would be claimed by Lake Erie. Designed by James P. Smith, the Margaret Olwell is a wooden-hulled steam barge constructed in 1887 in Cleveland. She came in at 544 gross tons and measured 176 feet in length. She was named after the first wife of the founder that owned the ship. The ship was designed to carry limestone from the quarry at Kelly's Island on Lake Erie to Cleveland, and for nearly 12 years, the ship did just that. On the evening of June 28, 1899, the Olwell, under the command of Captain John Brown, departed Kelly's Island bound for her usual destination in Cleveland with a load of 900 tons of limestone and a crew of 13. The weather was calm during the early stages of the voyage, but as she made her way to Cleveland, 50-mile-per-hour winds swept over Lake Erie, building massive waves that crashed into the freighter with punishing force. As the small freighter was battered by the winds and waves, her hull began to crack along her seams, allowing water to pour deep into her holds, causing the ship to develop a severe list. By 2 a.m., Captain Brown realized that his ship couldn't handle much more, and he decided to turn around to seek shelter along the shore. However, when the ship was making the turn, she lost her steering. Soon the ship was broadsided by a massive wave, and Captain Brown ordered everybody into the lifeboat, but it was too late. The ship was broadsided by another massive wave, and she capsized. Afterward, her cabin house ripped free from the ship and drifted away before the rest of her hull disappeared beneath the surface of Lake Erie. Luckily, 4 of the Olwell's crew members were able to grab onto the floating wreckage of her cabin house, but they struggled to keep themselves out of the water. They spent 4 hours on the damaged cabin house. Then at 5:15 a.m., Captain Willoughby of the steamer State of Ohio came across a large debris field where they found the 4 men on the cabin house. The crew of the State of Ohio tossed lifelines to rescue the men, and they were soon brought aboard. In the end, 9 people lost their lives in the disaster. A handful of the bodies of the Olwell's crew were found over the coming days and weeks. Many theories emerged on what caused the Margaret Olwell to sink when she did. Some claimed that the ship was overloaded, making it easier for the ship to take on water as waves broke over her deck. Others claimed that the ship was simply overwhelmed by the storm, which was unusually powerful for early summer. The wreck of the Margaret Olwell was discovered in 2017, around 30 miles west of Cleveland, in roughly 50 feet of water at the bottom of Lake Erie. On the night of December 8, 1909, the iron-hulled steamer Clarion was fighting through a rough, late-season gale in northern Lake Erie while carrying a cargo of grain. Massive waves repeatedly crashed over her deck, and visibility was poor due to the driving snow and a dense fog bank. Although her crew didn't know it, their ship would not be consumed by the storm, but instead a devastating inferno. Labeled hull number 45, the Clarion was constructed in 1881 by the Detroit Dry Dock Company in Wyandotte, Michigan for the Erie and Western Transportation Company based in Erie, Pennsylvania. She would be one of the first ships on the lakes to have an iron hull rather than a wooden hull. The ship was launched on July 27, 1881, and entered service a few weeks later. She came in at 1,712 tons and measured 241 feet or 73 meters in length. The ship was designed to carry general cargo throughout the Great Lakes, and for the next 28 years, she reliably did just that. On December 7, 1909, the Clarion, under the command of Captain Thomas J. Bell, departed Chicago with a load of grain, flour, and mixed cargo bound for Buffalo, New York. The Clarion managed just fine as she made her way through Lake Michigan and Lake Huron, but when she passed through the Detroit River and entered Lake Erie, a strong gale swept over the lake. By nightfall on December 8th, the Clarion was facing the full force of the storm. Soon the ship had entered the stretch of water between Pelee Island and Point Pelee, Ontario, known as the Pelee Passage. Pelee Passage is one of the most dangerous stretches of water on Lake Erie because of its shallow waters and many navigational hazards. At around 7 p.m., the ship was around 2 miles west of Southeast Shoal, when engineer Alfred Welch and first mate Jim Thompson smelled a distant odor of wood smoke. They knew that the ship's boilers weren't the source of the scent, so first mate Thompson went below deck with a fire extinguisher to investigate. Only a few moments later, the ship's power failed, plunging the steamer into darkness. And soon the vessel's hallways were filled with thick smoke as the Clarion quickly caught on fire. Only a few minutes earlier, the ship was fighting her way through the storm, and now she was engulfed in flames. The gale-force winds only fed the flames, causing the fire to move further aft, and her wooden decks were now providing fuel to the fire. Captain Bell hoped that he might be able to beach his ship on the nearby shoals, but the fire was spreading too quickly to do anything. Luckily, they were less than a mile from the Point Pelee life-saving station, so the captain and 12 crew members boarded her metal lifeboat and left the ship. They were never seen again. 7 crew members were still on the ship when the captain and 12 crew members left the ship. They tried sending distress signals, hoping that the Point Pelee lighthouse keeper would hear them, but due to the fog and heavy snowfall, it was impossible for their signals to be seen. The ship's engineer, Alfred Welch, then climbed the ladder on the side of the Clarion's funnel and started manually sounding the ship's whistle, hoping that their distress signal would be heard. 7 crew members still on the ship lowered the Clarion's wooden yawl so they could evacuate. However, before they could even board the boat, the monstrous waves surrounding the ship quickly flooded the boat. Crew member Joe McCauley tried to bail the boat before it capsized in the raging seas, and McCauley was dragged beneath the waves. He never resurfaced. On top of that, the boat was lost too. Now, only 6 men were left on the ship. They waited several hours for rescue, as the fire ate away at the vessel. Luckily, the nearby steamer H.B. Bope, which was ironically the first freighter on the lakes to use wireless equipment, spotted the flames through the blizzard. Her crew immediately notified other ships in the area, and soon the freighter Hosea G. Monroe received the call from the Bope and raced to the area. Unfortunately, the Monroe ran aground on Southeast Shoal. There was nothing they could do as the Clarion drifted away and disappeared into the fog. Finally, 4 hours later, Captain Anderson of the freighter Leonard C. Hanna spotted the ship and sailed over to offer assistance. After considerable effort by Captain Anderson, the Hanna was able to rescue the 6 men on board. The exhausted men were soon taken to Cleveland, where they were treated for their injuries from the sinking. Once they recovered, the 6 survivors went to Buffalo to speak with the ship's owners. The 6 survivors said that the captain of the H.B. Bope could have saved everyone on the ship had they stopped, rather than simply reporting the ship sinking. But the captain of the boat quickly denied these claims by saying it would have been impossible for him to mount a rescue in the brutal conditions. Unfortunately, the 13 men who boarded the ship's metal lifeboat didn't survive the storm. All but 2 of the bodies of the ship's crew were found. Today, the wreck of the Clarion lies just east of Southeast Shoal, around 30 miles north of Lorain, Ohio, at the bottom of Lake Erie. However, the Clarion was not the only ship claimed by that storm. Same day the Clarion caught on fire and sank, the car ferry Marquette and Bessemer No. 2 vanished on Lake Erie after departing Conneaut, Ohio. To this day, her wreck remains undiscovered. Labeled hull number 428, the Marquette and Bessemer No. 2 was constructed in 1905 by the American Shipbuilding Company in Lorain, Ohio for the Marquette and Bessemer Dock and Navigation Company, and was launched on September 12, 1905. She came in at 2,514 gross tons and measured 338 feet or 103 meters in length. She was powered by 2 quadruple expansion steam engines, which drove twin screws for a top speed of around 10 knots. The ferry was designed to transport railroad cars and occasionally passengers between Conneaut, Ohio, and Port Stanley, Ontario, and for the next 4 years, the ferry reliably did just that. But in November of 1909, the No. 2 was caught in a rough November gale. You see, railroad cars would be loaded on the ferry through the stern, but the ship did not have a gate to prevent water from entering her stern. During the voyage, as the ship was battered by the heavy seas, a huge amount of water was able to enter the opening in her stern. She only barely survived the ordeal. Following the voyage, the ship's captain, Robert McLeod, complained to the ship's owners about the open stern. Luckily, they agreed to install a gate on the ship at the end of the season, but the ferry would continue sailing in the meantime, and she continued to do so for the next few weeks. On December 7, 1909, the Marquette and Bessemer No. 2 was loaded with 30 rail cars in Conneaut, Ohio, bound for her usual destination in Port Stanley, Ontario. The ship was scheduled to leave port at 8 a.m., but before she could cast off, a nearby freighter that was being tied up for the winter snapped free in the building winds and blocked the channel. 2 hours later, the freighter was secured and the No. 2 could depart. But as soon as she started her engines, a man ran up the dock and shouted for the ship to stop. Some of the crew echoed his calls, and Captain McLeod turned his ship back toward the dock, and the man was able to jump aboard. He was the ship's single passenger. Then, at around 10:45 a.m., the ferry slipped out of Conneaut Harbor and into Lake Erie. Around the same time the ship departed, winds were exceeding 50 miles per hour, and massive swells broke over the bow of the ferry. The last confirmed sighting of the Marquette and Bessemer No. 2 came when she passed the West Breakwater, where crew were working to install a new fog signal. Captain McLeod shouted to them to get it fixed because he might need it on their way back. The crew rang the fog bell, and soon the No. 2 sailed for the open lake. By late afternoon, a full gale had set in over Lake Erie, and continued to intensify over the next few hours. Strangely, throughout that night, people on both sides of Lake Erie claimed to have seen and heard the No. 2 battling her way through the storm, but she never arrived in port. Over the next few weeks and months, debris and bodies from the ferry were discovered all over Lake Erie. It's believed that the open stern allowed water to pour into the ship and send her to the bottom, but without any survivors, it's impossible to know for sure. Almost immediately after the vessel went missing, the Marquette and Bessemer Dock and Navigation Company ordered a replacement ship that would be built using almost the exact same plans. The new Marquette and Bessemer No. 2 was launched on September 3, 1910, and entered service on October 6, and she was equipped with a stern gate. The company received harsh criticism for using the same name for the ship, implying that they were hoping to erase the disaster from memory. The new ship sailed for nearly 90 years until she was scrapped in 1997. As of the making of this video, the wreck of the original Marquette and Bessemer No. 2 remains undiscovered. In late October of 1916, the remnants of a hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico merged with two other storm systems over the western end of Lake Erie. Often referred to as the Black Friday Storm, it was one of the deadliest storms to ever hit Lake Erie. 4 ships met their end in the storm, claiming the lives of 49 sailors. Perhaps the most notable shipwreck during the Black Friday Storm was the whaleback freighter James B. Colgate. Labeled hull number 121, the Colgate was constructed in 1892 by the American Steel Barge Company in West Superior, Wisconsin. She was built at a time when whaleback freighters were becoming fairly common on the lakes. The vessel was launched on September 21, 1892, and entered service on October 17th. She came in at 1,713 gross tons and measured 308 feet or 94 meters in length. In 1901, the Colgate was sold to the Pittsburgh Steamship Company, based in Cleveland, which operated the vessel until 1915 when she was sold to the Standard Transit Company, based in Duluth, Minnesota, and her nearly 24-year-long career was mostly uneventful. In the early morning hours of October 20, 1916, the Colgate, under the command of Captain Walter J. Grashaw, departed Buffalo, New York with a load of coal bound for Fort William, Ontario. It was Captain Grashaw's first voyage in command of the James B. Colgate. He knew the ship well since he had spent the previous decade as her first mate. As the Colgate pulled away from the pier, heavy rain and winds were building, but Captain Grashaw was confident that his ship could survive the growing storm. The Colgate passed several other vessels as she slipped out of Buffalo Harbor. The crews had all decided it was best to wait out the storm. As the frigate reached the open lake, she struggled to make headway, as she was battered by the punishing winds and waves. Her tarps had all been shredded, but due to her whaleback design, it was impossible for her crew to secure the hatches. By the evening, it was clear that her hatches wouldn't hold. As water poured into her hold, her cargo of coal shifted, and she developed a severe list. Suddenly, one of her forward bulkheads collapsed, allowing a massive amount of water to spill into her forecastle. The Colgate began to settle by the head, and it was clear to her crew that she was at the mercy of the storm. At 10 p.m., Captain Grashaw gathered his crew as their ship disappeared beneath the surface, throwing the men into the churning seas. Captain Grashaw and his crew struggled to stay above the water, and when Grashaw was about to take his last breath, the Colgate's raft bumped into him. 2 men were already on board, and they lifted him into the boat. The 3 men spent several hours on the raft, struggling to keep from being thrown into the raging seas, before suddenly a massive wave flipped the raft over, and the men were thrown into the lake. The captain and 1 other crew member managed to climb back on, but the 3rd crew member was nowhere to be found. They spent another several hours on the raft before it flipped over once again. However, only Captain Grashaw was able to climb back on. He spent more than a day and a half on the raft, but on the morning of October 22nd, the car ferry Marquette and Bessemer No. 2, the same one that replaced the original Marquette and Bessemer 2 that was lost a few years earlier, came across Captain Grashaw in the raft. He was on the brink of death when he was brought aboard, but in the end, he survived. He was the only survivor from the James B. Colgate. While mostly forgotten today, the Black Friday storm was one of the deadliest storms to ever hit the Great Lakes, and the James B. Colgate was just one of 4 ships claimed by Lake Erie in the storm. Lake Ontario is the smallest Great Lake by surface area and the second smallest by volume. Lake Ontario is also at the lowest elevation above sea level than the other 4 lakes. The St. Lawrence River, which connects the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean, starts in Lake Ontario. But just like the other 4 lakes, Lake Ontario has a deadly reputation when it comes to shipwrecks. Thousands of wrecks lay at the bottom of the lake, many of them are poorly documented and remain undiscovered. Here are 5 ominous shipwrecks on Lake Ontario. On October 26, 1898, the 25-year-old schooner St. Peter departed Oswego, New York with a full load of coal bound for Toledo, Ohio. However, the very next day, the schooner would find herself at the bottom of Lake Ontario. Constructed in 1873 in Toledo, Ohio, the St. Peter was a wooden-hulled 3-masted schooner designed to transport general cargo throughout the Great Lakes. She came in at 290 gross tons and measured 136 feet or 41 meters in length. She navigated the Great Lakes for 25 years with no major incidents, but that all changed on the morning of October 26, 1898. The St. Peter departed Oswego, New York with a full load of coal bound for Toledo, Ohio, via the Welland Canal. However, just a few hours after she left port, Lake Ontario was being overtaken by a massive storm, with 70-mile-per-hour winds and 20-foot waves. Since they were unable to reach the Welland Canal, Captain John Griffin of the St. Peter decided to turn around so they would run with the wind. The ship fought her way through the storm for 12 hours, but in the early morning hours of October 27th, the St. Peter finally succumbed to the storm. She rolled over and sank just a few miles offshore. All but Captain Griffin was able to escape the sinking ship. When the storm cleared, he was rescued by a boat from the life-saving station in Charlotte, New York. He was the only survivor from the St. Peter. In the end, 8 people were lost in the disaster. The St. Peter sank in only 117 feet of water, so when she went down, her masts were still above the water. They were later removed so they wouldn't be a danger to passing ships. In 1971, most of the remains of the ship were recovered from the wreckage. Today, the wreck of the St. Peter lies only 5 miles northeast of Sodus, New York, in around 120 feet of water at the bottom of Lake Ontario. The wreck is a popular dive site, and it was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in March of 2004. The wreck is also part of the Lake Ontario National Marine Sanctuary and is one of the most accessible wrecks to divers on Lake Ontario. Exactly 14 years after the loss of the St. Peter, another vessel was lost in the St. Lawrence River. Labeled hull number 844, the Keystorm was constructed in 1910 by the Swan Hunter and Wingham Richardson shipyard in Wallsend, England for the Keystone Transportation Company based in Montreal. The ship was launched on March 30th, 1910 and entered service a few weeks later. She came in at 1,721 gross tons and measured 250 feet or 76 meters in length. She was designed to traverse the locks of the St. Lawrence River and the Welland Ship Canal, allowing her to transport cargo between the St. Lawrence and the Great Lakes, and her brief career was productive and mostly uneventful. On the afternoon of October 25, 1912, the Keystorm departed Charlotte, New York with a load of 2,273 tons of coal bound for Montreal. At around midnight, the Keystorm passed the Tibbetts Point Lighthouse and entered the St. Lawrence River. Not long afterward, the ship's captain passed command over to his first mate and left the bridge, but when he retired to his cabin at 3 a.m., a dense fog bank set in over the St. Lawrence. Despite this, her crew did not reduce the ship's speed. The captain was extremely apprehensive about his first mate's skills, and the weather conditions at the time only made him doubt his skills even more. Regardless, the Keystorm soon passed the Sunken Rock Lighthouse in Alexandria Bay as she made her way downriver. The first mate soon saw the light from Sisters Island Lighthouse through the fog, but he didn't see the buoy which marked the nearby shoals. Then, in the early morning hours of October 26th, the first mate called down to the captain, but it was too late. In the fog, the Keystorm struck the Skull Island shoals. Not long after the collision, the Keystorm slid off the rocks and into deeper water. In just a few minutes, the Keystorm rolled over onto her starboard side and disappeared beneath the surface of the St. Lawrence River. But fortunately, all of her crew survived the sinking. Following the sinking, the captain and first mate were found guilty of negligence for not taking appropriate action when they encountered the fog bank. Although there were no casualties, the Keystorm was declared a total loss. In 1917, the wreck of the Keystorm was sold to James Richardson and Son of Kingston, Ontario, and in 1919, her cargo of coal was salvaged. Today, the wreck of the Keystorm lies on her starboard side in roughly 115 feet of water at the bottom of the St. Lawrence River. In early August 1917, another three-masted schooner went down on Lake Ontario in almost the exact same circumstances as the St. Peter. Constructed in 1882 in Muskegon, Michigan, the George A. Marsh was a wooden-hulled three-masted schooner designed to transport bulk cargo throughout the Great Lakes. She came in at 175 gross tons and measured 118 feet or 36 meters in length. She was constructed at a time when schooners were still fairly common on the Great Lakes, and by the early years of the 20th century, she would frequently be towed by a larger vessel. The Marsh underwent several refits during her career, and in April 1914, she was sold to J.B. Flint of Belleville, Ontario. Aside from that, her 35 years on the lakes were largely uneventful. On August 7, 1917, the George A. Marsh, under the command of Captain John W. Smith, departed Oswego, New York with a load of coal bound for Kingston, Ontario. On board were many of Captain Smith's relatives, including his wife and 5 of his children. However, only 3 hours after the schooner left port, a summer storm began to churn up the lake. By that evening, the Marsh battled 35-mile-per-hour winds and massive waves that repeatedly broke over her deck. On top of that, she had also sprung a leak. Her pumps were unable to keep up with the leak, and the ship was filling with water faster than it could be pumped out. The ship sat so low in the water that Captain Smith realized that the only way to keep his ship afloat was to beach her on the shoals off Pigeon Island. All through that night, the Marsh continued fighting her way through the storm, but in the early morning hours of August 8th, she suddenly rolled over and disappeared beneath the surface, throwing all 14 people on board into the raging seas. One of her lifeboats had drifted free from the ship, and 2 crew members were able to climb on board, but the other 12 never resurfaced. In the distance, the lightkeeper at the 9 Mile Point lighthouse spotted the George A. Marsh go under, but there was nothing he could do to offer assistance. That night, the 2 men in the lifeboat fought their way through the monstrous waves, and they soon made it to Amherst Island. The next morning, they were rescued by a local fisherman. They were the only survivors from the George A. Marsh. Many theories emerged on what caused the ship to have such a high loss of life. Some claim that the crew members bringing their family and children on board was a bad idea. Others also claim that the George A. Marsh was well past her prime, and was not seaworthy enough to handle the storm she sank in. The ship sank in only 80 feet of water, so her masts were still above the water when she sank. A few months after she went down, her masts were removed so they wouldn't be a danger to passing ships. But in the end, the George A. Marsh was just another victim of the Great Lakes. In the early morning hours of May 31st, 1926, the Canadian freighter Nisbet Grammar was making a routine voyage from Buffalo, New York to Montreal when she was enveloped in a heavy fog bank on Lake Ontario. Unbeknownst to the crew, however, in just a few hours, they would be on a direct collision course with another freighter and would end up at the bottom of Lake Ontario. Labeled hull number 901, the Nisbet Grammar was constructed in 1923 by the Campbell Laird & Company shipyard in Birkenhead, England, for the Eastern Steamship Company, based in St. Catharines, Ontario. Her keel was laid down on February 2, 1923, and her hull was launched a few months later on April 14th. She came in at 1,725 gross tons and measured 253 feet or 77 meters in length. She was built as a canal freighter, designed to traverse the lock of the St. Lawrence River and Welland Ship Canal, and for the next 3 years, she reliably transported various cargo throughout the Great Lakes. In the early morning hours of May 31st, 1926, the Grammar departed Buffalo, New York with a load of grain bound for Montreal. She soon made her way through the Welland Ship Canal and reached Lake Ontario, but at around 4:30 a.m., the Grammar was overtaken by a dense wall of fog. At the same time, another vessel, the 5-year-old freighter Del Warwick, was also making her way across Lake Ontario not far from the Grammar when the fog set in. The crew of the Grammar reduced their ship's speed as the fog continued to thicken. The fog was so thick that neither vessel could see each other. They could only hear the faint sounds from the Del Warwick's fog whistle. Both ships navigated through the fog for the next hour, before suddenly the crew of the Grammar heard the Del Warwick's fog whistle literally in their path, and soon the Del Warwick emerged from the fog. The captain of the Grammar ordered the ship to turn hard to starboard to avoid being struck by the Del Warwick, but at that point it was too late. At around 5:30 a.m., the Del Warwick struck the Grammar on her port side near the stern, piercing her boiler rooms and cutting the ship's power. Her crew knew that they didn't have long until their ship would sink. They deployed a few of their lifeboats, and the crew of the Del Warwick sent some of their lifeboats as well. Only 15 minutes after the collision, the Grammar sank stern first and disappeared beneath the surface of Lake Ontario. Fortunately, all of her crew made it off the ship and onto the Del Warwick. The wreck of the Nisbet Grammar was discovered in August of 2014 by a group of researchers. She lies 30 miles from the shore of Somerset, New York, in roughly 500 feet of water. As of the making of this video, she remains the largest shipwreck on Lake Ontario. At around 2:30 a.m. on the morning of September 17, 1949, Don Church, a fire insurance specialist, was on board the passenger steamer Huron while she was docked in Toronto. He soon discovered that the ship's hallways were filled with smoke, and he also found a small fire in a locked closet. He called one of the Huron crew members who went to open the closet, but when he did, the flames exploded, and the fire began to quickly spread throughout the ship, leading to one of the deadliest maritime disasters on the Great Lakes. Labeled Hull No. 6, the Huron was constructed in 1913 by the Western Dry Dock and Shipbuilding Company in Port Arthur, Ontario for the Canada Steamship Lines, or CSL for short. She was one of 8 passenger cargo vessels built for CSL in the late 19th and early 20th century. The vessel was launched on June 2, 1913, and she entered service a few weeks later. She came in at 6,905 gross tons and measured 362 feet or 110 meters in length. She was designed to carry passengers and cargo throughout the Great Lakes and could accommodate 600 passengers and 200 crew. For the next 36 years, the Huron reliably transported passengers and cargo all across the lakes, and even earned the nickname Queen of the Lakes during her career. On September 14, 1949, the Huron departed Detroit for a 7-day pleasure cruise of Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, where she would sail through Lake Ontario and stop in Toronto along the way, then travel up the St. Lawrence River to Prescott, Ontario, before then sailing back through Lake Ontario and Lake Erie and finishing her voyage in Sarnia, Ontario. On the evening of September 16th, the Huron arrived in Toronto Harbor and docked at Pier 9. While she was docked, many passengers had left the ship to explore the city, while others stayed on board. The passengers who left the ship had returned to the vessel at just after 10 p.m. At 2:30 a.m., Don Church was returning to his cabin on the Huron when he found the hallways filled with haze, which soon turned into a cloud of smoke. He soon found a fire in a locked linen closet, but when a crew member came to open the closet, the fire quickly burst out and engulfed the room. The passengers and crew tried to extinguish the fire, but they failed to put it out. Don Church soon went to alert his family. 30 minutes later, half of the Huron's decks were engulfed in flames. The first mate sounded the fire alarm, but it failed to get most of the passengers' attention. On top of that, her whistle was malfunctioning at the time, and the captain wasn't on board at the time. Many of the passengers were still asleep when the fire started, giving them almost no hope of escape. For those who managed to navigate through the smoke-filled hallways and make it on deck, they faced another problem. The ship was repeatedly moving back and forth away from the pier, so if they tried to jump overboard, they would get crushed between the ship's hull and the concrete pier. A ladder was soon raised to the ship to assist the people still on board, which did help the passengers to a certain extent. Later, the fire department and police had arrived on the scene to rescue the passengers and put out the fire, but the fire continued to rage on. When the fire eventually went out, the Huron was now a gutted shell, resting at the bottom of Toronto Harbor. She remained there for a few months before she was salvaged from the bottom of the harbor and was towed to Hamilton, Ontario to be scrapped. It's estimated that at least 119 people lost their lives in the disaster. The cause of the fire remains a mystery. After the Huron disaster, safety regulations on Great Lakes steamers had been heavily changed, but to this day, the fire aboard the Huron remains one of the deadliest maritime disasters on the Great Lakes. In addition to the 5 shipwrecks we just mentioned, it's said that Lake Ontario has its own Bermuda Triangle, similar to Lake Michigan. The Marysburg Vortex stretches between Oswego, New York, Kingston, and Prince Edward, Ontario, and just like the Lake Michigan Triangle, it has had an unusual amount of strange disasters and sightings. In fact, the George A. Marsh, which we covered earlier, is said to be a victim of the Marysburg Vortex. In 1889, the schooner Bavaria was being towed in the area when the tow line snapped, and she drifted away. The ship was found a few days later near Main Duck Island, completely abandoned. No trace of her crew was ever found. Then, in 1900, another schooner, the Picton, disappeared on Lake Ontario in plain sight of 2 other vessels. The only trace of the ship ever found was a message in a bottle. It's believed that the high number of shipwrecks can be explained by the fact that Lake Ontario narrows as it nears the St. Lawrence River and becomes much shallower, creating navigational hazards for passing ships. Known as the Duck-Galoo Ridge, it lies between Main Duck and Galoo Island. But even with the high number of disasters and strange sightings, Lake Ontario isn't much different than the other 4 lakes in terms of shipwrecks, although many of Lake Ontario's shipwrecks are poorly documented and remain undiscovered.